What's up, YouTube? Welcome back to another video. So today I'm actually going to be changing out the brake discs and brake pads in my WRX. So here I have the DBA T2 rotors, and then I have some Hawk Performance street pads. I'll put the link down for these exact pads and rotors. The OEM pads and rotors, they work fine, but I just wanted something that had like a little bit more bite and just felt a little bit more, sporty. So, I did some research and I heard that these are some really good rotors and these pads are pretty good. So these are good for like street driving, and then also if you want to do some light track use, these are also going to perform pretty well. They do have, more aggressive pads, but I also wanted something that wouldn't create a tremendous amount of dust. Usually the beefier the pads, the more dust they're going to have, and I don't want to be cleaning my wheels every other week. So we'll see how this whole setup works. First thing you're going to want to do is get your car, jack it up so that you can remove the wheels and get access to the rotors and pads. So I have my car in the garage. My car's pretty low, so I have some low profile ramps so I can get enough clearance to stick my jack underneath. So the way I normally do brakes is I do them one side at a time. So I'll do the front pair and the back pair. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to jack up the front end, work on the front brakes, lower the car, jack up the rear end, and then work on the rear brakes. Okay, so here I'm in the front passenger side. I got the car jacked up on jack stands. I also have my jack supporting the center of the car underneath, extra support, and now I have the wheel off. Remember to crack the lug nuts loose before you start jacking up the car, otherwise the wheel might just spin as you're trying to break loose those lug nuts. So, okay, once you get the wheel off, you have here your caliper and your bracket. So what I normally do first is I'm gonna remove the bolt that holds in the caliper to the bracket. So there's two, and they are 14 millimeters. So remove those two first, and then you should be able to separate the caliper from the bracket. And then after we do that, we can remove the bracket itself. So this is the actual bolt that I was referring to. So this one's actually pretty easy to crack loose. So I have one here, and there's another one on the bottom side. So once we get that one out, we should be able to pull this caliper off. So once you have the two bolts removed, you can just start pulling on the caliper, like wiggling it out slowly. It should come off. So I also have a bucket here in the back. So you don't want this to just be hanging because then it could damage it. So ideally you want to put either like a bucket, or maybe you can hang it with like a wire, so that way you're not putting tension on the brake line. Okay, so now I have my caliper over there. I put a little piece of cardboard on top of where the bucket is because the bucket was too low, so that way there's no pressure on the brake line. So now you can either try to pry out the brake pads or remove the bracket and then remove the brake pads. So for the bracket, there's two bolts on the back side holding it in, and there's 17 millimeter bolts. This bolt right here, and then there's another one right beneath it. So those are 17 millimeters. Remove those, and then you can take off the bracket. Once you get your brake caliper bracket off, you could then go ahead and remove the rotor. So there's actually two holes. There's one right here. There's another one on the opposite side. So depending on how well those threads are, you can actually get a screw, tighten it in there. If you get the the right size, tighten it in there, and that'll gently push the rotor off of the hub. This is the first time I'm actually changing the brakes on this car, so this might be kind of tough, and also those threads look really messed up. So another thing you could do is just hit the rotor itself, like hit it on opposite sides until you can kind of like break the rust loose, and then it'll come off. So that's what I'm actually gonna do. Ideally you want to use a rubber mallet, but if not, a regular hammer can do it, but just remember it's gonna be very loud. So once you have the old rotor off, you want to make sure that you clean the hub surface so that when you put the new rotor, it mounts properly. So just get a wire brush and just clean it off as best as you can. And then you can also use like a brake parts cleaner and penetrating oil to try to get rid of all that rust. So once you have the hub cleaned off, you can grab your bracket and take off the old clips. So this clip right here, I'm gonna replace this one, and this clip right here. You can just pull them off. I'm not gonna need them, so it doesn't matter if they get damaged. And then after you take them off, you just want to clean the surface that they will sit on. That way the new ones seat nicely. So once you clean off the bracket and take off those clips, you should inspect the actual guide bolt. That when you push it, it pops out and it's not stuck. Ideally, you want to pull it out enough and fill it up with a little bit of grease. The clip pack that I bought came with extra boots, but after inspecting these look fine, so I'm just gonna reuse them. So all I'm gonna do is fill up the boots with a little bit more grease. I have my guide pins greased up, so they rotate nice. I press them in, they pop back up a little bit. Doesn't have to be crazy, but you just gotta make sure that they're not like stuck. You gotta make sure they rotate, they can go in and out. So now I have my clips. Time to put these guys on. So it doesn't matter if you put this one on the top or bottom, it's the same type of clip. Okay, so it looks like it goes like this. Line it up, and then you kind of just squeeze it in to place. Just like that. So now that one's in. And then do the same thing on the opposite side. So just line it up. And then squeeze it into place. There we go. There we go. And just like that. And now the pins are good. The bracket is pretty much ready to go back on the car. So before you mount the rotor, make sure to use some brake parts cleaner and spray any of the metal surfaces, because there is like a oil film that they put on it when they ship it to prevent it from rusting. So yeah, just spray it down with a little bit of brake parts cleaner. It should evaporate pretty quickly. Make sure that it's nice and dry, and then you can mount it on the car. These rotors do have a painted surface though, so just make sure not to get any brake parts cleaner on the painted surface, otherwise the paint's gonna wear out or come off. So just paint the actual brake disc and the inside where it will mount to the hub. So before we put the rotor on and before we put the pads on, we actually have to push in the pistons in the caliper. See this piston here? We got to push that back. Before we can do that though, you're gonna go into your engine bay, and that yellow cap over there is where you put in the brake fluid. So you just want to open that cap to relieve the pressure. That way it's easier for us to push the piston back in. And then I'll show you guys how to push the pistons in. Okay, so here I have this piston pusher tool. And basically what I do is I get one of the old brake pads. So I line up my caliper. Get my old brake pad. Get my caliper pusher tool. And then basically, I just twist this until I make contact with the brake pad, and then I just push in the pistons. And then what I do is I'll push one side a little bit, and then go to the other side, and push the other one. If you have the Brembo brakes, it's gonna be a little bit different because I think those are 4 pistons in the front. This is for the regular WRX brakes. Pistons pushed back in. So before we put the new rotor, there is some gear head grease or high temp brake part lubricant. I don't have any of this. I think it's like the bronze like anti-seize. That'll work. But basically put a little bit of this on the surface where the rotor will mount to the hub. Put this also on the little clips that the pads will ride on. And then also when you put your pads, I'll show you, on like the little ears, the parts that slide in and out, you want to put a little bit of this grease on that as well. So now I got the brake pads on the bracket, and I have them with the high temp grease. Before I mount the bracket, I'm actually going to use a little bit of anti-seize on the brake caliper bolts. That way they don't seize up and they don't get stuck. And I'm just going to put a tiny bit, not much, just a small amount. So the caliper bracket bolts, torque these down to 59 foot-pounds. And then the bolt that holds in the actual caliper to the guide pin, this is, I believe, 20 foot-pounds. Now I'm in the back of the car. So I have the back jacked up. I removed the rear wheel. And as you can tell, this is pretty worn out actually compared to the fronts. These look a lot worse. Yeah, it's a good thing we're changing all these out. So same thing as the back. The first thing you want to do is remove the guide pins over here, those bolts, and then from there, right here where my finger is, that is the caliper bracket bolt. So the same thing as the front. Remove the guide pins first, then we can peel back the caliper. Also, don't forget to release the parking brake when you're working on the back. The parking brake is going to be on the inside of the brake because the rear brake also acts like a drum brake when it comes to the parking brake. So if you have the parking brake on, it's going to make removing the rear rotors, a lot more difficult. And the car, I actually have it lifted up completely. So, the parking brake doesn't even matter anymore. So I'm just going to put down the parking brake. That's going to make removing the rear rotors much easier. So I have the caliper removed. I kind of just rested it on the lower control arm. And then on the back, both the guide pin bolt and caliper bracket bolt, they're both 14 millimeter. And also, as you can tell, this rear, it almost looks like there's nothing left of the pads. So these are like super worn out. So in order to actually remove the rear brake rotor, there's a little plug here. So you got to remove this plug, and then you're gonna want to rotate the drum until you find. So I don't know how well you guys can see it, but in there, there's like a little gear. So you're gonna get a flathead screwdriver, and you're gonna rotate the gear downwards, and that's gonna pull the brake pads for the parking brake in. So that'll pull them in so that they're not against the rotor, and then you could pull the rotor off. So after a few hammer smacks, it pops right out. And then here is the assembly for the parking brake. So there's the parking brake assembly. As you can see, these pads here, there's one here, one there. Those squeeze, they push outwards towards the inside of the disc or the rotor, and that's how your parking brake works. So yeah, and this little gear down here, so as you rotate it downwards, that'll pull those pads inwards. Okay, so now that this is done, I'm gonna go ahead and clean the surface off, remove the clips that are on the caliper bracket, compress the caliper piston, and remember to open up the cap for the brake reservoir. And then these are actually really, they move very fluidly. So I might just, I don't know, I might leave them alone or maybe just put a little bit of grease on them, but those look really good condition. So I'm not gonna replace them. It might be very, very dark, so I don't know how well you can see this, but I'm gonna compress the back spring, which is actually like really pushed out. So I already loosened the cap in the brake reservoir, and as you can see here, I'm just gently squeezing that piston back in. So as you can see, you don't have to go crazy fast, you know, go slow. Make sure that the rubber boot doesn't, like, you know, collapse on itself or something. As you can see, it goes back in. Nice and easy. And the reason that you release or open up the cap for the brake reservoir is that way it makes it nice and easy for the fluid to go back. Because if this was like all the way, like if the cap was closed, this would be a lot harder to push back. And then, you know, just make sure that you're not squeezing the rubber boot part, because you don't want that to like pop or anything, because then you're really gonna have an issue. So it looks like the piston's all the way in. So now we should be good. And this thing's like rusty on the inside, so if you can like clean it out as best as you can. Yeah, that thing is gross in there. And just like with the front rotors, you want to use brake parts cleaner to clean off the rear as well. And then on this one, make sure you also spray in here, because this is where the parking brake will squeeze against. So yeah, and then get like a rag, something you don't care about, so that way when you spray the brake parts cleaner, you can wipe it off. And then before you start mounting the caliper and all that stuff, make sure to put this little rubber plug back on the rotor. And then also inside, make sure that you push those pads back outwards so that they're not, don't push them out so far that they squeeze on the rotor and it can't move anymore. But push them out so that they're either just barely riding on them or slightly separated. And then you'll be able to tell you're good, because you should be able to freely rotate this without any like crazy resistance. If it's like super tight, then that means your pads are way too tight and you have to loosen them back. I put a little bit of grease on the back side. Be careful though, you don't want to put so much grease on the back side of the rotor, because then it's going to prevent the parking brake from being able to properly press against the inside of the rotor, the drum part. I got the slides, the pins or the brackets that the brake pads slide in. Put a little bit of that high temp grease on both sides, and then also just a little bit on the ears that the brake pads have. That's where they slide in and out. So just put a little bit, not too much. That way they can slide easily. And then with these hawk pads, so on the fronts, both of them actually have this little wear indicator. So basically when your brake pads get super, super low, this piece will ride against the rotor and make a loud squealing sound, letting you know that, hey, your brake pads are almost out. On the rears, the outside one does not have that. The inside one does. And the reason the inside one does is because the brake piston is pushing against that inside pad. So it's putting more pressure on that one as opposed to the one on the outside, which is why the inner pads usually wear out much quicker. But anyway, so yeah, the one with the pin goes on the inside. The one that doesn't goes on the outside. Alright guys, and then when you're putting everything back together, the caliper bracket bolt, over here where my finger is, 59 foot-pounds. And then the caliper to guide pin bolt, 20 foot-pounds. So, alright, so now the rears are done. The fronts are done. Time to put the wheels back on the car, lower the car, and then remember, before you start driving, remember to pump the brakes a few times, because since we pushed those pistons all the way in, they're nowhere near where they need to be to properly squeeze the brake rotor. So pump the brakes a few times until you feel them nice and firm, and then go out for a drive. And then for the hawk pads, you actually have to do what's called, I think it's called burnishing. So basically, you almost like wear the pads into the rotors. Like you have some pad material, you transfer it onto the rotor material, you know, by getting them really hot. And that way in the future, once you hit the brakes, you get a very strong like bite. So if you were to just leave the brakes like this and just go for a drive, I mean, yes, they'll probably feel a little bit better than stock, but you're not really gonna get the full benefit from them until you burnish them. So I'm gonna get the car back on the ground, clean everything up, and yeah, that's how you do your brakes. Like the video, give a thumbs up, subscribe. I still have lots more stuff, performance stuff I need to do, and yeah, thanks for watching.